first hot air balloon ascended in June 1783, and soon enough, balloon mania had spread across Europe like wildfire. And, as always, thoughts quickly turned towards utilising this new technology as an instrument for war. However, despite the French creating two companies of aérostiers during the Revolutionary Wars, by war's end they had been disbanded and they formed no part in any of the armies of the Napoleonic period that followed. To many generals of the day, the idea of having a bird's eye view of the battlefield, allowing complete vision of all the enemy's movements, as well as that of their own troops, must surely have been appealing, so why did they not encourage or insist upon its use? Some historians believe that the principle of aerial observation was sound, but too revolutionary for the somewhat hidebound military theorists of the day. Others even suggest that it was Napoleon's own ego that prevented their acceptance in military circles. In spite of the early successes of the military balloons, it is sometimes suggested that Bonaparte's inflated self-opinion of his own talents as a military tactician may account for his apparent lack of enthusiasm for their continued use. At the end of the day, he was tied to convention and relied upon his fast-moving cavalry to provide the reconnaissance information he needed. Or maybe he agreed with the Austrians that the presence of the balloons was not a gentlemanly act. What is certain, however, is that disdain turned to downright hatred when fate, chance, call it what you will, dealt this highly superstitious leader a most unwelcome omen. As easy to believe as each of these explanations may be, neither are true, and in the following video I'm going to discuss the early history of observation balloons, their use during the Revolutionary Wars, and why they were ultimately rejected by Napoleon and his contemporaries. The man credited with the invention of the hot air balloon was a Frenchman named Joseph Montgolfier, who, upon reading about Henry Cavendish's discovery of inflammable air, or hydrogen as it would later be known, began to experiment with it, being particularly intrigued by its molecules possessing less density than air. It seems, however, that Montgolfier didn't quite understand the science, and although his early experiments did involve hydrogen, mainly filling small paper and cotton globes with it, he was left dissatisfied as the gas seeped out far too quickly. Despite this, he did make a separate observation which, while scientifically false, was in his mind linked to the lifting power of hydrogen and would help to get his ideas off the ground. Observing that smoke and cinders would rise above a fire, he concluded that the process of combustion must in itself be generating quantities of this mysterious, inflammable air. Not quite appreciating that it is the hot air that is lighter than ordinary air, rather than the smoke, he set about generating the smelliest and most obnoxious bonfires he could muster, burning damp straw, wool, old shoes, and even rancid meat, to generate as much smoke as possible. As luck would have it, this billowing, sooty smoke also blocked the pores of the fabric, and now, filled with hot air, his spheres took to the skies, which goes to prove what a little healthy ignorance can achieve. Despite this ignorance, Montgolfier's imagination was sparked, and helped further in his experiments by his younger brother, Etienne. The two of them began to dream bigger, and on the 5th of June 1783, they set up the very first public demonstration of their work in the town square of Annonay, a small town in southern France and home to the Montgolfiers' paper mills. Measuring 25 feet high, the yellow and red balloon was hoisted upright between two wooden poles above one of Joseph's special bonfires, and in that moment, as the inanimate heap of fabric stirred into a living, breathing creature, a power magic cast its spell. The townspeople watched with awe as the balloon swelled and once released soared silently upwards to a height estimated at about 6,000 feet. It then drifted for 10 minutes in the gentle breeze before coming back down to earth 1.5 miles away. Although thoroughly mundane by modern standards, word of this initial flight rapidly spread throughout France, though once it reached Paris it was received with disbelief and in some quarters even disdain. The reason for this was most likely one of pride. The Montgolfier brothers were from a small town, but another reason could be that of science. The Montgolfiers' method was clearly crude and failed to understand the true implications of hydrogen. Professor Jacques-Alexandre César Charles therefore decided to restore the prestige of the Paris Academy and, possessed with a much clearer understanding of the composition and properties of hydrogen gas, he set about making his own balloon. He was aided in this endeavour by two brothers, Noël and Jean Robert, who had conveniently perfected a technique for coating fine silk with a solution of rubber so as to make it impervious to gas, and led by Charles, they began to construct the world's first hydrogen balloon. The Montgolfier brothers may have sent the first large balloon airborne, but thoughts now turned to floating man up into the skies, and the race between the two teams was on. It would again be the Montgolfier brothers that took the lead, bringing Paris to a standstill in September 1783 when they mounted a cockerel, a duck and a sheep underneath their balloon and sent them up into as then uncharted territory. Despite it being known that people lived in mountainous areas and thus at higher altitudes, there were seemingly genuine fears for the safety of the animals once airborne, but the animals returned to Earth alive, albeit most likely shaken, and the only injury sustained was an accidental one, that of a broken wing inflicted by a swift kick from the sheep. With fears abated, it was the Montgolfier brothers firmly in the lead, and they began to look into manning their craft. Several tethered test flights took place, and by mid-November 1783, the Montgolfier balloon was ready for free flight, though it would need some pilots. Despite the possible dangers, and even initial reluctance from Louis XVI, who insisted a volunteer be instead found amongst the prison inmates, a young aristocratic daredevil, Jean-Francois Pilatre de Rosières, along with his friend Francois Laurent, the Marquis de Orléans, managed to convince the king otherwise and stepped forward to become the world's first aeronauts. With the pilots selected, on November the 21st, the Montgolfier brothers began to create another of their obnoxious pyres, over which they began to inflate a giant but magnificently decorated blue and gold balloon. At 1:54 p.m, both de Rosières and the Marquis stepped aboard their craft, and with the tethers cut, thus began the first manned descent. Despite the excitement, the two pilots were not able to simply enjoy either the moment or the increasingly impressive view, for their time in the sky would be brief if they failed to tend the pyre which was keeping their craft in the air. Equipped with pitchforks, both men fed the fire and kept buckets of water on hand to prevent the craft itself from catching fire. 25 tentative minutes later, the craft touched down 900 yards away, and the first manned flight was complete. It had been a modest first outing, with the balloon climbing to an estimated height of between 2,000 and 3,000 feet, and it had been a risky one too, with the ever-present danger of fire engulfing their fragile craft, but it wasn't to be long before a more robust balloon flew over Paris. Despite the disappointment of losing the race to send man into the skies, Professor Charles and the Robert brothers continued to work on their own craft, and only 11 days later, from the Tuileries garden, they sent it airborne, the first ever hydrogen balloon, into the skies above Paris. This type of balloon would come to dominate the ballooning scene for the next 200 years. Such was the ingenuity of Charles's balloon design that it has served as a virtual blueprint for gas balloons ever since. The spherical envelope was fitted with an open tube at its base to serve as a simple safety valve to release any excess pressure, thus preventing the balloon from popping as the gas expanded with the reduction in the ambient air pressure at height. It was covered by a net held in place by a ring around the envelope's equator, and from this suspension lines ran down to the boat-shaped gondola in which the two men rode. In order to control the balloon, sand ballast was thrown overboard to make it climb, and to come back down, gas was vented via a wooden valve fitted at the apex of the envelope. Because hydrogen has about 3 times more lift than hot air, the balloon was much smaller than the Montgolfiers, and altogether a more robust craft with none of the inherent dangers of an onboard fire. The only drawback to Charles's design, and that of the hydrogen balloon, concerned the gas itself. Sufficient quantities of hydrogen had to be generated, and this was at the time achieved by passing diluted sulfuric acid over iron filings. As the reaction between these two compounds took place, the fumes of the hydrogen created were piped into sealed casks in order to cool before they could be fed into the balloon. This process was expensive, and it took many long hours to generate and collect the quantities of gas needed. This method would also pose a further problem, one which would come up at times of war. The issue was that sulfur was essential to the production of gunpowder, and therefore an alternative method of creating the hydrogen would be required. Despite these problems, Charles's balloon, with himself as one of the pilots, made its triumphant debut launch to an estimated 40,000 spectators, and remained airborne for 2 hours, landing safely some 27 miles away, near the small town of Nestlé. It had been a truly magnificent tour de force, demonstrating for the world to see the superiority of the gas balloon over its hot air rival. Very soon, news of these ascents and the excitement for ballooning would spread, not just throughout France, but all of Europe, and more aeronauts began to seize upon and mimic Charles's designs and take flight in their own gas balloons. While few of the early aeronauts provide information about how exactly they came across information about balloons, it seems clear that their sources provided sufficient information for them to copy the technology for themselves. Thus, knowledge about the construction of the frame, the making of the hot air or hydrogen, the materials used to cover the balloon, and the nature of the gondola all travelled swiftly across nations, continents, and oceans with a sufficient level of detail to allow for considerable mimicry. The pace of this dissemination and appropriation was impressive. The Montgolfier brothers launched their first balloon in June 1783, and experiments in Paris and Versailles followed from August through December of the same year. Fall 1783 also saw similar events in Great Britain and Russia, and by the spring of 1784 similar launches would take place throughout most of Europe. Manned launches quickly followed in a number of places in 1784. Many of these experiments were carried out locally, with the initiative and personnel coming from the immediate area. Despite this, once the initial furore had died away, few places outside of France and England continued to fund and undertake launches. Lynn suggested a possible reasoning for this could be because both Britain and France had higher wealth and literacy rates than most other nations at this time, though culture may have also played its part. Although not all equal in their enthusiasm, each nation who had experienced at least some level of this balloon mania soon enough turned their thoughts into utilising this new technology for war. In England, in early 1784, a pamphlet was published by an unknown author who proposed the adoption of balloons for reconnaissance on land and at sea, as well as for long-distance signalling. Others tended to focus upon the idea of using the balloons to transport armies in an aeronautical invasion fleet. The British in particular were fearful of the French launching such an endeavour in order to cross the Channel. Despite the many ideas that floated around, some of them more far-fetched than others, it would be in its birthplace where the military use of balloons would begin. As stated, their popularity throughout France had continued, and with flights being seen as both liberating and intellectual, it should come as no surprise that once the revolution struck in 1789, balloons continued to appear in celebrations and festivals, including Bastille Day. Some launches during the French Revolution were not linked specifically to national festivals, but still had political overtones. B. Lalemant de Sainte-Croix undertook an ascension in September 1791. His balloon was decorated with patriotic images representing liberty, love of country, France, and the law. Standing in the gondola, shaped like a rooster, he held the new constitution in his hand while sailing over the Tuileries, the Louvre, and the Champs-Élysées, all to the accompaniment of the applause of the immense crowd that had gathered to watch. He threw out copies of the Constitution to the people below. As can be imagined, once politics became involved, it was not to be long until their military use was to be fully examined. In 1793, and with France now at war with most of the major European powers, they needed every advantage that they could find, and the infamous Committee of Public Safety was soon recommending the adoption of balloons for observation. First, however, the issue pertaining to the production of hydrogen had to be resolved, considering that all sulphur was now required for the production of gunpowder. Fortunately, it didn't take long. The leading chemist Lavoisier was consulted to find an alternative, and he proposed the production of hydrogen by passing steam over red-hot iron. Consequently, in October of 1793, the government passed a decree ordering the construction of a balloon for the Army of the North and allocated the considerable sum of 50,000 livres for its construction and the support equipment. Placed in charge of this new endeavour were two scientists, Jean-Marie Joseph Coutel and Nicolas Jacques Conté. Coutel, born in 1748, had actually been a pupil and friend of Professor Charles, the creator of the first hydrogen balloon, and therefore was perfectly suited to the task. His colleague Conté, born in 1755, although having less experience with ballooning, was somewhat of a prodigy. At age 9 he had constructed a violin to concert standard, and at age 14 he had completed the painting of a chapel at Sées after the original artist fell ill. He then became a portrait painter, but once the revolution robbed him of many of his wealthier clients, he turned his attention instead to the study of physics and mechanical inventions. As soon as he was given command, Coutel immediately reported to the army headquarters of General Jean-Baptiste Jourdan, the commander of the Army of the North, currently engaged against the Austrian forces. Unfortunately, Coutel was greeted with both skepticism and suspicion by Jourdan and his staff. He was accused by one officer of being a spy, and another wrote to the Committee of Public Safety in disgust that a battalion was needed more than a balloon. Undeterred by these slights and confident in the value that his company and their balloon could provide, Coutel persisted, and upon eventually gaining the ear of Jourdan, it was decided that further experiments should be conducted away from the dangers of the battlefield. Coutel therefore returned to the side of Conté at the Château de Chalais-Moudon, which had been gifted to them for their research in the outskirts of Paris. It was here that they constructed and tested what was to become the first military aircraft, the hydrogen balloon, and aptly named l'Entreprenant. In appearance, l'Entreprenant, or Enterprise, was much like previous gas balloons, but it had been constructed to be especially strong to withstand the buffeting of the wind and the strain of prolonged tethering. A spherical balloon tends to bob up and down with every gust, resulting in a ride that is said to be an alarming experience for the uninitiated. To prevent it spinning, this balloon was held captive by 2 tether lines attached at its equator, although some contemporary engravings also show other lines leading from the basket. To maintain an approximate state of equilibrium, the point at which the balloon's lift more or less equals its load, Coutel had devised a clever system whereby the balloon was ballasted at equilibrium at ground level, and as it climbed, ballast was released to compensate for the increasing weight of the ropes. In theory, this put less strain on the balloon and helped to reduce the workload of the ground crew who raised or lowered it by means of a simple windlass. Many engravings depict this operation being carried out by the men themselves, and on one exceptional occasion it is said that 64 men struggled to keep hold of their aerial charge. In none of the accounts have I found any indication that the pulling strength of horses was applied to the task, and this may be because they were too valuable to be spared from the battlefield. The balloon itself was to be manned by 2 men, a pilot and an observer. The observer was, by way of both signal flags and handwritten messages that were then slid down the tether ropes in small weighted bags, to report on the enemy's strength and position, whilst also potentially directing the fire of the artillery of his own army. With the balloon constructed, it was time to put their ideas into practice, and early in 1794, Coutel and his team put on a demonstration at Chalais-Moudon, where l'Entreprenant rose to a height of around 1,700 feet, the full extent of its tether line, and Coutel and Adjutant General Rodet were easily able, through the use of a telescope, to distinguish the winding River Seine a full 18 miles away. The test was a success, and at the end of March 1794, Première Compagnie des Aérostiers was officially formed. Commanded by the newly commissioned Captain Coutel, the corps was a well-organised unit consisting of 7 officers and 20 men, including a drummer boy. Most of the men were selected because of a particular knowledge in chemistry or skills in carpentry or masonry, the latter for the construction of the large on-site furnaces required for the creation of the hydrogen. Resplendent in distinctive uniforms of blue with black collars and cuffs piped in red, each man was also armed with a sabre and 2 pistols. The unit was immediately dispatched to join the French forces around Maubeuge, where their equipment was made ready and sent after them. Despite their smart uniforms and newly acquired ranks, the soldiers of the army still viewed them with trepidation and as scientists, not soldiers. Therefore, upon arrival at the front, and at Coutel's orders, they were sent into the thick of the fighting, where, by all accounts, they acquitted themselves well enough to silence their critics and to earn the respect of their brothers in arms. Once their equipment arrived, however, they immediately set to work readying l'Entreprenant for its maiden combat flight. Once airborne, the balloon and company functioned exactly as intended, and Coutel, from his vantage point, observed the dispositions of the Austro-Netherland troops, communicating them to his superiors on the ground via flags, luminous balls, and messages dropped from the balloon. The balloon also caught the Allies' attention, and soon enough Coutel was about to experience the first ever anti-aircraft fire. The Austrian gunners dug ditches in order to lower the rear of their guns and therefore raise their barrels, and upon Coutel's 5th descent they opened fire, one of the cannonballs actually glancing the basket of the balloon and forcing Coutel to ascend another 1,300 feet in order to get out of danger. Despite this, the Austrians soon retreated, and the Aérostiers were ordered to join General Jourdan's newly formed Armée de Sambre et Meuse, whose main goal was to secure passage over the Sambre and therefore a foothold into Belgium. It was on the Sambre that the Austrians were enjoying an unbroken run of victories. 5 times the French had tried to cross the river, only to be thrown back by heavy losses. Only the arrival from the south at the end of May of Jourdan and his reinforcements gave them the necessary impetus. Despite this, Jourdan's initial effort to force a crossing met with the same fate. On the 12th of June he crossed the Sambre and began to besiege Charleroi, only for his 66,000 men to be pushed back across the river by 44,000 Austrian and Dutch troops under the combined command of the Prince of Orange and Beaulieu 4 days later. So once again the French found themselves recrossing the river, leaving behind 3,000 men and 8 guns. This time, however, they allowed their enemy no respite. Urged on by Saint-Just, who just returned from Paris, Jourdan tried again 2 days later. It was to be 7th time lucky. For Coutel and his men, it was decided that, because building the gas-generating furnaces took time, they would travel the 20 miles from Maubeuge to Charleroi with the balloon fully inflated, but lowered to a height just high enough that mounted troops could ride underneath it. Coutel remained in the basket and the rest of his men pulled the balloon along using ropes, most likely a humorous sight, though it was not an easy task. After 15 hours of this hard slog under the unremitting summer sun, the exhausted and hungry balloonists arrived at Charleroi to the rousing cheers of their countrymen. Already the value of the balloon in raising the morale of the troops was evident, as was the reverse effect on their adversaries. It had arrived at a key moment, for Charleroi surrendered to the French that same evening, and some even argue that it was the sight of the balloon that caused capitulation, though this isn't proven. The capture of Charleroi was to prove key for Jourdan, however, because on the 26th the relief force, 52,000 strong, led by Saxe-Coburg, had arrived to relieve the city, unaware of its recent surrender. With all of his army now freed from siege work, Jourdan formed his 76,000 men in a crescent shape north of Charleroi, each wing being anchored on the Sambre. Despite their numerical disadvantage, the Allies, confident from a procession of victories and still believing that Charleroi could be saved, began to attack, pressing the French back in all sectors. Soon enough, Coutel was back aboard l'Entreprenant and flying high above the battlefield, sometimes accompanied by General Molot. Both men from their bird's-eye view were able to observe the movement of the Austrian troops and sent dispatches to Jourdan throughout the battle. The battle raged for over 12 hours, and despite the Allies consistently forcing the French back, even capturing the villages of Fleurus and Lambersart, as well as pushing to within a mile of Charleroi itself, it was ultimately not enough. It was now that the importance of the fall of Charleroi on the previous day became apparent. It was Hatry's troops, released from siege duties by the surrender, who were now sent from the reserve to hold the line. More important still, it was also at this point that Coburg learned for the first time that the city was in French hands, the terrible news brought from behind enemy lines by the intrepid Lieutenant Radetzky. At once Coburg decided to disengage. Although the French had clung on and claimed a vital tactical victory, because of the naive placement by Jourdan of his troops in a thin crescent shape, it was the Austrians who had spent much of the day in the ascendancy. In fact, Blanning suggests that the Austrians probably should have taken the day if it were not for equally poor tactical decisions by their commander, General Coburg. Even making allowances for being wise after the event, it is difficult not to criticise Coburg's tactics. As he had only 52,000 troops at his disposal, his only chance of victory was to punch a hole in the French lines in the hope of turning their flank. Just pressing the enemy back on Charleroi was worse than useless, for with every step backwards the French soldiers took, they rectified their commander's original error of spreading them too thinly. The longer the battle went on, the more likely it became that eventually French numerical superiority would tell. Although Weighley also agrees that a better coordinated attack might have won victory for the Austrians, he also credits Jourdan with the ability to send in well-timed reinforcements at crucial areas that saved the battle for the French. This ability perhaps could have something to do with the information that Coutel and Molot passed down from their vantage point, and one French soldier, Charles Francois, who fought at the battle, certainly seemed to think so. A balloon hovered over us, governed by means of ropes. 2 officers occupied it and made known by signals the movements of the enemy. We took a battery of 8 guns and found some of them loaded and pointed at the balloon, which had contributed greatly to win the battle. The historian Paddy Griffith disagrees, however, suggesting that their observations were misleading and erratic. The final word on the battle is probably best given to Coutel himself, who remained characteristically modest on the matter. I will not claim, as do those who praise or blame with exaggeration everything that is new, that the balloon won the Battle of Fleurus. On this memorable day, every corps did its full duty. What I can say is that, well served by my glass, despite the oscillation and movement caused by the wind, I was able to distinguish clearly the corps of infantry and cavalry, the parks of artillery, their movements, and in general the massed troops. Whatever their real impact, being a new and different factor for an army which had failed 6 times before, they were given much of the credit, especially once the true impact of the battle came to be realised. Having retreated from the field, Coburg was instructed to continue his withdrawal completely out of Belgium as the Austrians abandoned their fight for the Netherlands province. Better than that for the French, the battle also helped to mark a key turning point for the revolution. The victory at Fleurus seemed to indicate that the French Republic was no longer in mortal danger, and therefore that the terror was no longer necessary to assure the stability of France against both external and internal enemies. The conspiracy to depose Robespierre, the excesses of his regime, began to gain momentum. Consequently, a second company of aérostiers was ordered, although it would take nearly 12 months for them, along with two new balloons, Hercule and Intrépide, to join the Army of the Rhine, where they saw service in the sieges of Mayence and Mannheim before moving on towards Strasbourg and taking part in the campaigns there. As for Coutel and his first company, they followed Jourdan's victorious army into Brussels, once again pulling their balloon along as they went, although this time disaster was about to strike. As it was paraded through the streets of Brussels, its silken fabric became snagged on one of the buildings. With a sigh of escaping hydrogen, it sagged on the ground in a sorry heap. They repaired the balloon, and were in fact sent another one, but that one proved, because of its cylindrical nature, unstable in the wind, and therefore unsuitable for observation. Despite this, the first company continued to serve with Jourdan's troops until the Battle of Würzburg, where the French were defeated and Coutel, along with his entire company, as well as their balloons, were captured by the Austrians. It seems that Fleurus was set to be the pinnacle for the aérostiers because, although the first company were liberated in April 1797, the presence of balloons on the battlefield decreased as time went on. The second company was transferred to the army of the Sambre-et-Meuse under General Hoche, who had nothing good to say about balloons and declined to put them into service at all. There is mention of balloons forming a part of Napoleon's famous Army of Italy during his first campaign there in 1796, but I can find little to no mention of their actual activity, and it is realistic to conclude that they were rarely, if ever, used. Napoleon did, however, take a company of aérostiers, this time led by Conté, on his Egyptian expedition, though most accounts seem to indicate that their equipment was never unloaded and in the Battle of the Nile was consequently lost to the sea. Conté, deprived of his balloons, turned his many talents towards the construction of corn mills, machines for printing, for making coins, producing steel, precision tools, surgical instruments, and even trumpets for the cavalry. In between, he also found time to devise a system of signalling, using small captive balloons supporting a pulley on which the signals might be hoisted to be visible from afar. Napoleon was promptly impressed by both the man and his work, declaring, "The chief of these aeronauts was a universal man, with the taste, the knowledge, and the genius of arts, good to everyone and capable of creating the art of France in the very midst of the deserts of Araby." He even had Conté promoted for his work, and when Napoleon requested that several balloons in the style of the Montgolfiers be constructed and launched in an effort to impress the locals, it was most likely Conté whom he trusted to oversee the endeavour. Unfortunately, these balloons made little impression on the people, and after 3 launches the ordeal was abandoned. On 18th of January 1799, 2 weeks after the last of these ascents in Cairo, the French government disbanded the 2 companies of the Corps des Aérostiers without stating any reason. It may have simply been to save money, but the balloon school at Chalais-Moudon was closed down. It seemed that the balloon experiment had already ended less than 5 years after the first company had been formed. The question then is why, if the observations of Coutel were crucial at Fleurus, and if the technology was indeed sound, were they abandoned and not brought back under Napoleon, or even by any other nation during the period? I believe that there are potentially 2 reasons, but the second is the most likely. Firstly, the battlefields during the Black Powder Age, once battle had begun, were notoriously shrouded in smoke from all the weapons firing. They would have most likely made observations difficult, and is potentially why at the Battle of Fleurus, Griffith suggests that Coutel's observations were unreliable. Of course, reconnaissance before a battle or during a campaign was still vital, and the observations made by a team in a balloon could surely have provided useful information, but herein lies the second problem: time. Battles at the end of the 18th century were no longer the static affairs that they had once been, and the style of warfare brought forth by the armies of revolutionary France and then perfected under Napoleon stressed this movement and mobility even further. Napoleon's armies often outmarched their supplies and would famously live off the land rather than trail a large baggage train with them. A company of balloonists would therefore not have been able to keep pace with these marches, their equipment having to be transported on carts. But even if they could have kept pace, constructing the furnaces used to produce the hydrogen and then actually inflating the balloons during this period was no quick task, and it could take up to 48 hours to get a balloon airborne. Generals simply couldn't afford to wait that amount of time before either engaging or being engaged. The French style of warfare, which would influence most of Europe, was designed to mass different corps at a critical point, conducting the battle on their terms and before the enemy was ready. Napoleon had won many battles by simple means rather than by subtlety, by gambling on surprise, by swift movements which struck at the main force of the enemy and crushed it while the defenders were still reeling from the shock. Whilst this wasn't always the case, the idea of allowing the enemy to either vacate or reinforce a compromised position in order to give time for a balloon to be inflated and floated up for better reconnaissance was simply not practical. Therefore, whilst observation balloons perhaps would have been useful during sieges, where there would have been adequate time to inflate the balloon, their lack of utility on the battlefield generally made them less desirable for an army to carry around with them. Finally, to address the point that Napoleon supposedly hated them. Most people who hold this view refer to the incident during his coronation where one of the balloons broke free of its guide ropes and drifted away, supposedly landing in Italy and causing laughter around Europe for what was seen as a bad omen. The truth, however, is that Napoleon didn't hate balloons. Despite some historians believing that it was he that disbanded the aérostiers, as shown earlier, it was the convention that ordered their removal, and at the time of this, Napoleon was still in Egypt, and not set to return for several more months, therefore he cannot be blamed for the decision. Whilst the coronation incident was true, though to what extent is debatable, and Napoleon did eventually fire his chief balloonist, Jacques Garnerin, because of it, he eventually replaced him with Sophie Blachard. Blachard took over as the emperor's official balloonist. She continued to work for Napoleon and, after his fall, became the official aeronaut of the Restoration, a position she held until her death. Sophie's experience with balloons came through her husband, Jean-Pierre, one of the first professionals and much celebrated in the early period, performing the first manned flights in Hamburg, Leipzig, Berlin and Nuremberg, and taking part in the first manned flight across the English Channel. However, his untimely death left Sophie with many debts, and she continued in her husband's footsteps in order to pay them off, and eventually became even more famous than him until her own unfortunate and traumatic death in 1819. Her downfall came in trying to please her many fans. She frequently launched globes from the Tivoli Gardens in Paris, a pleasure garden popular during the Restoration. To enhance her spectacles, Sophie added fireworks, shooting them off from the gondola. In July 1819, she announced a special spectacle which she then had to delay several times due to poor weather conditions. However, in the end she decided to go ahead with the launch in the less than ideal weather. A spark from the fireworks ignited her balloon and she crashed onto the roof of a house, was thrown from the gondola onto the roof and from there onto the street below. She died in front of the house at 15 Rue de Provence in Paris on 6th of July 1819. Despite a general confusion surrounding the topic, hopefully this video has shown that the limited use of observation balloons during both the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars was not because of a conservative mindset by the generals of the day, nor was it because Napoleon bore a deep-seated hatred of them. It was simply because the technology was impractical for use with the style of warfare being implemented during the period. Balloons would go on to see use in the American Civil War, but the story of aeronautics in America's Civil War should have told of the military balloons coming of age with the advent of telegraphic communication, aerial photography, and efficient mobile gas generators. Instead, it is one of petty rivalries and jealousy, inflated egos and deflated balloons, all tangled up in a web of bureaucratic red tape and confusion. By the time of the First World War, each side possessed several observation balloon field units. It would seem that the static warfare of the trenches would finally see the observation balloon reach its potential, and indeed balloons were ever present over the scarred battlefields of Europe, with each side operating an estimated 500 observation balloons during the 4 years of conflict. However, the skies were no longer as safe as they had been, thanks to both the untimely invention of the aeroplane, as well as the increased accuracy and power of anti-aircraft fire. Worse, in the final months, as the war became mobile once again, the Allied balloonists laboured to keep up with the advancing front, and it seemed that the same problem had, 100 years later, appeared once again. Until next time, thanks for watching.